Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Understanding Disproportionality webinar. During today's session, we'll be discussing the topic, how to look at your data to address disproportionality. I am Heather Goma, the New Jersey State Coordinator for RAL Mid-Atlantic, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Joining me is my co-host from the New Jersey Department of Education, Dr. Laura Marana, who is the Interim Executive County Superintendent for Middlesex and Monmouth counties, and our presenter, Dr. Catherine Voulgarides, the Senior Research Associate from the NYU Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. Before we advance with the agenda, I would like to point out ways to communicate with the webinar team and with each other. In the top right corner, there is a parking lot where you can post questions and comments about the webinar content. In the bottom right, there's an area where you can ask for help with technical issues that you may be experiencing. So on to the session agenda. We'll start with an overview of RAL Mid-Atlantic, followed by a brief discussion of the collaboration between RAL Mid-Atlantic, the New Jersey Department of Education, and the NYU Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. We will then hear from Catherine Voulgarides during our presentation segment, take questions during the Q&A period, and then finally wrap up. So now let's meet RAL Mid-Atlantic. For those of you who don't know, RAL Mid-Atlantic is one of 10 regional educational laboratories throughout the nation. We are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. Our particular service region includes New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. For those of you who are participating from states that I did not mention, trust that you do have a RAL that serves you in your region. RAL Mid-Atlantic, like all of the RALs, provides no-cost research services, direct research services, and technical assistance support to education stakeholders throughout our service region. All of our services emphasize research and data use. Direct research services include descriptive studies, policy scans, literature reviews, research syntheses, and rigorous studies. Our data-focused technical assistance products and services range from trainings, workshops, and webinars to white papers and how-to guides. So now that you know a little more about RAL Mid-Atlantic, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Laura Marana, who will move us along to the goals of this webinar series, and then introduce our presenter, Catherine Voulgarides. Laura?
Thank you so very much, Heather, and also thank you to all of you for participating in the webinar series, which promises to be a highly stimulating learning experience for all of us, including all of you out there, superintendents, assistant superintendents, principals, vice principals, content area supervisors, I know that you're out there as well, teachers, as well as members of institutions of higher education, among many others. One of the key things that we wanted to highlight, as you can see on the slide, is that we have some specific goals set for this particular set of webinars, which we believe will serve as an introduction to a comprehensive professional development program that will be more sort of job embedded and ongoing and sustained, and you will hear a little bit more about that in just a little while. The goals are pretty much self-explanatory in the sense that the expectation is that as practitioners in both New Jersey and New York, and actually right now across the nation, you will gain a deeper insight into equity and disproportionality as an outcome of the collection, use, and analysis of data, the identification of root causes, as well as the analysis of existing policies and practices. And of course, you will learn more about research knowledge based on cultural competence and equity. So you certainly are going to find the session highly stimulating once again. And moving right along, one of the key things that I would like to do is to begin by acknowledging the contribution of staff members at RAL and also the Technical Assistance Center at, on Disproportionality, at NYU. to this webinar series and the upcoming in-person training to be held in summer 2016. It is only with their remarkable and ongoing support that educators will be able to gain a deeper understanding of educational equity and disproportionality. They recognize how challenging the work of our superintendents, principals, and teachers, among others, has become. However, they also recognize your authentic desire to engage in reflection, strategic thinking, planning, and execution of a plan that reflects, once again, strategic and systemic solutions. And in response to your commitment and in support of your work, particularly as you take ownership of disproportionality issues and the challenge in establishing an interrelationship between disproportionality and student learning and achievement, we all recognize that technical support is necessary. So today you are taking a very important first step. REL and NYU stand ready to support your efforts in creating a sense of urgency around the issue, as well as I want to thank them both for contributing to the professional development of our educators and the success of our students. We are just simply thrilled to have this partnership, which began a number of months ago, almost a year ago, once again in support of our classroom teachers, administrators, and the overall school community. So thank you so very much. Okay, moving right along, we have just briefly, once again, you are looking at the introduction to a summer training program, an in-person training that will be held in summer 2016. It will be taking place on the campus of Rutgers University, centrally located in New Jersey here, as well as looking at the 2 weeks that will be convenient, we believe, for educators to be able to come together and further explore this concept. But also one of the key reminders that I will present to you is the fact that there's no fee, there's no cost associated with the upcoming webinars, training sessions. So I'm hoping that you will take advantage of that. More information will be provided to you shortly. So with that, we certainly are going to get ready to begin with today's presentation. And I could not be more honored to have with us Dr. Catherine Voulgarides leading today's webinar. Her academic background and practical experience are impressive and quite extensive, to say the least, while her research interests are centered on the intersection between the impact of federal disability legislation and the persistence of racial and ethnic disproportionality. She is interested in the overall complexity associated with equity and disproportionality in our schools. She obviously has practical teaching experience. She has an extensive training. Her doctorate degree was completed at NYU, and she continues to be an advocate for everyone in the field, so we can attack this area in a proactive and also very strategic kind of way. She has been at the Metro Center since 2009 in a variety of roles, including serving as a Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality Project Associate. I could go on, but we really want to get to her presentation. So I am so delighted that Catherine is leading this presentation right now, and I thank her for being part of the project. And without any further delay, I introduce to you Dr. Catherine Voulgarides. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was such a nice introduction. I appreciate it. I'm excited to take part in this webinar and to also share some of the resources and conversations that we have on a regular basis with the districts that we work with at the Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. For a brief overview of the day, we're going to go through 5 different parts. We're first going to establish a common language and understanding of disproportionality, because oftentimes while we can understand inequities and achievement gaps and differences between different racial groups or gender, ethnicity, culturally, linguistically diverse students, disproportionality, the way that it's understood in special education legislation, has a very unique definition that will kind of drive us as we go through the PowerPoint slides. In addition, part 2, we are going to kind of look at the data that helps explain how we got here. How did our districts, how did our school districts become disproportionate? And then part 3, we will be talking about disproportionality in your district specifically and thinking about the different data points and the different metrics that you can look at and analyze and try to determine what some of the root causes might be that's contributing to the issue in your district. I'm not sure why it's jumping around, but back to part 4, we're going to talk about securing, again, the types of data that you need for the analysis to understand disparities in your district. And for part 5, I will share just a few tools that we offer and have given to districts within New York State. So part 1, establishing a common language and understanding of disproportionality. Disproportionality comes directly from IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act legislation, and there's 3 specific indicators that the federal law requires state education agencies and local education agencies to monitor disproportionate outcomes by race and ethnicity. The one that we'll be talking about the most today is indicator 4, which refers to the discipline outcomes of students with disabilities. But indicator 9 and 10 are also very important. They are related to the disproportionate placement and classification of students with disabilities. And oftentimes when you have conversations about disproportionality on classification and placement, you see that there are disparities on the more subjective, as they're called, or high incidence disability categories, like emotionally disturbed, speech and language impairment, learning disabled. These categories tend to have racial disparities manifest within them. And then in terms of the indicator 4, which is discipline and suspension or expulsion of students with disabilities, you see an intersection between those high incident disability categories and disparate outcomes in disciplinary action and referrals. So disproportionality has actually been part of IDEA legislation for many years. It has been an effort of the federal government and advocates of students with disabilities to monitor. However, it does not have a lot of teeth when it's applied to practice because as recent reports have shown, this is a recent report coming out of the U.S. Department of Education just on February 23rd, there's wide disparities across the nation on disproportionate outcomes. However, there is very little reduction in disproportionality, and so it's problematic because we know that these disparities are occurring. We know that there's legislation, and IDEA is designed to protect students with disabilities and provide equal opportunity. However, the mechanisms within IDEA legislation to address disproportionality are not able to stop it. And so in addition with this discussion about what can we do to address this persistent issue, there's been recent movement to talk about amending IDEA to require states to have a universal formula to identify disproportionality, because as we exist now, every state can set a different threshold for identifying it. There's different criteria for determining how we're supposed to address it in practice by using policy, and a lot of that has to do with the state's kind of climate. Is it a state that's very focused on compliance, or is it a state that is focused on compliance but doesn't put as much time into certain aspects of IDEA legislation? So it really depends on the climate of a state. And so the bolded text saying for the changes in legislation says the proposed equity in IDEA rule would for the first time require states to implement a standard approach to compare racial and ethnic groups with reasonable thresholds for determining when disparities have become significant. So if you're confused on what disproportionality is, or if it's confusing to understand across how it manifests in your state, your district, or across the United States, it's understandable because it is something that's still being worked out within legislation. So I'm going to go into how disproportionality is now defined in order to situate ourselves within this complex concept that affects all school districts across the United States. So disproportionality in the most simple terms is really an overrepresentation of a specific group in special education programs or disciplinary outcomes relative to other groups. And it also represents an underrepresentation of a specific group in accessing intervention services, and really the key is high quality intervention services or resources or programs or rigorous curriculum that allow students to fully succeed. So oftentimes we can have equal access to different resources or different interventions and services, but it doesn't always mean that there is going to be an equitable outcome. And so disproportionality is trying to understand, why is it that we have overrepresentation of certain groups and what's contributing to this issue. And that's a lot of the work that we do at the Technical Assistance Center on disproportionality, to work with school districts and try to really get at some of the root causes that contribute to this persistent issue. And one of the main things that we discuss about disproportionality is that there's not one single solution and there's not one single cause to the issue, because disproportionality, the research on the subject and the way that practice has shown, and over time the inability of policy alone or of one intervention stopping the persistence of disproportionality lets us know that there's something really complex embedded in this issue. And so one of the big things that we talk about through this, and will actually come up in the future webinars of this series, is that there's really an interaction between policies, which is what I just talked about with IDEA legislation, and that can go to district policies, discipline policies. There's an interaction between practice, how we actually enact the policies, how we're interacting with students, and then practitioner beliefs. And these three factors come together to contribute and to work on addressing disproportionality. And as you can see, and again, this will come up in the future webinars, but we believe that beliefs are one of the central practitioner beliefs, and school systems in general are really driving how policy and practice are enacted. And this is something that we have to really think about when we're trying to address disproportionality, is that we can't just focus on one person, we can't focus on one policy, we can't focus on one intervention or practice. We have this intersection of multiple factors that contribute to the issue. So just to add a little bit more depth into how complex the issue of disproportionality is, there's research that points to many factors that contribute to the issue. For example, and especially in the case of the context of this webinar, discipline policies and practices can be they can be punitive or they can be exclusionary. The most extreme example is something like zero tolerance, but oftentimes if you have a zero tolerance policy, you can see more students being suspended or referred for disciplinary action, and disproportionate outcomes by race can manifest from there. And that's then tied into another root cause of disproportionality that shows up in the research, is that you can have insufficient or not very effective interventions and referrals. While we do know there's many systems like response to intervention, there's PBIS, there's all these different programs that we can engage with as practitioners, they still are unable to stop disproportionate outcomes. And that may have to do with implementation fidelity, and there's multiple factors, but we know that there's something about the referral process for special education, there's something about the interventions that we have in place that are contributing to or part of disproportionality. Another cause is oftentimes instruction and assessment is not always to the highest bar, and this is because of multiple factors. We can have disproportionate outcomes can manifest because students don't have access to the best texts or to the most rigorous curriculum, or there could be oftentimes when you're secluded in a classroom in special education, the rigor of the instruction can be different than other classrooms. So you start to see not only students being classified with disabilities, but you also see that there's going to be an impact on achievement and on how students are understood to be learning. And that ties then into educational opportunity, and it's really thinking about what types of opportunities are being provided to students, and are those opportunities sufficient for optimal learning. And oftentimes, educational opportunity can also transcend and exit outside of school doors or district doors, because we're situated in a world that has, is highly segregated. It's resegregating school districts. We have different levels of economic, racial, cultural, ethnic, linguistic segregation and disparities across the United States, and that those differences affect our school systems and the types of resources we have. So we have to think about how different types of educational opportunity are afforded to our students, and how with the system that may be contributing to disproportionality, the way that our district is, where we are situated, who is in our school district, who our teachers are, all these different things bring together how educational opportunities provided to students. In addition, disproportionality is related to a lack of strong family and community ties, because if we don't have strong communication with our family and our community as a school or a district, then we're most likely to not have an understanding of who our students are, and we can see disproportionate outcomes manifest. A lot of research is also starting to pull on that beliefs aspect of that slide I just showed, where oftentimes disproportionality, and with discipline also in particular, you can see that teacher expectations and misconceptions can contribute to disproportionate outcomes. A behavior can be interpreted on those high incidence subjective disability categories as something that's different, that may not be the norm and could send a student into a referral system, or student behavior may be judged by someone within the school system that could push them towards disciplinary referral or action, when with another teacher or another school system it may not be interpreted that way. So we have these different forces of misconceptions and cultural dissonance that are also contributing to this complex issue. And then lastly, something that we'll really talk about in terms of data, because this is something that we can pull just from our basic records that we have in our school districts and school systems, is a change in sociodemographics. And as we all are aware, the United States is changing racially and ethnically and linguistically, and that means our school districts and our schools are also changing. But oftentimes the student population is changing faster than the staff that we have within our district. So we have this amalgam of forces where we have new needs of students, and we have interventions and referrals and instruction and assessment that may not be meeting the needs of the students coming into our districts. And then there might be aspects of dissonance occurring, and we can have discipline policies and practices that then contribute to disproportionality. So none of these factors live alone. They all live together, and that's why it's so important when we're engaging with work on disproportionality. We don't say that it's one person, one thing, or one aspect of a school system or students or families that's the cause of the issue. It's really a very, very complex issue that is related to broader achievement gaps and opportunity gaps that exist in our school system. So now that we are going to approach understanding disproportionality as a really complex phenomenon that doesn't have one cause in particular, we need to understand then what kind of data can we look at to give us insight into what's going on in our districts. How do states how do they understand disproportionality, and how has this been codified in legislation, and how are state education agencies and local education agencies really making sense of disproportionality? There's three different methods really for identifying it. The method that you often see in policy, and the piece that I showed about the U.S. Department of Education really relies on this relative risk ratio. And as we go through the slides, I'm going to show you examples of how the composition index, the risk index, and the relative risk ratio show you different ways that disproportionality manifests. But I just want to lay it out here. I'm not sure why I want to lay it out here in this chart in order to, sorry, the slides are changing, not sure why. I want to lay it out here to just let you know where we're going. And basically, the composition index is just going to show us the proportion of students in a particular outcome. This could be in disciplinary referrals, or it could be the proportion of students with disabilities in a district. It just is telling us, what percentage of students have this particular facet or outcome associated with them. The risk index, or the rate, kind of talks about the probability, like what is the chance that a student is going to exist in this category, or that a student will be referred for disciplinary action or suspended. And then the relative risk ratio, it takes different risks of different groups and compares them to each other so that we have a broader understanding not only of a particular race's risk of an outcome, but also in comparison to the composition then of a district, which is big because you can have a population, a school district that has multiple groups within it, and in order to understand how one risk index relates to another, we have to understand it in relation to each other, and hence the term relative risk ratio. So in order to go a little bit deeper, the composition index is the proportion of students by a specific categories, and this can be by any kind of social marker of difference or outcome that you can think of. And the differences in composition indices are the classic definition of disproportionality, where the proportion of the subset does not match the proportion of the larger set. So in order to show what I mean by this, this is a sample district. These are made-up numbers. But you can see in this district we have 71 Asian students out of 5,701 students in the district. The composition is then calculated by dividing 71 over 5,701. And that will give us that 1% of students in this district are Asian. So that's the composition of the Asian population in the district. And I have an arrow also on black students where we have 821 students out of the 5,701, and the composition is 14%. And so now we understand how many students of this particular racial category are in this district. But we can start to we can understand disparities when we pair it against some particular outcome. So below this, with the two bottom arrows, we see that the percentage of students with disabilities of the racial group, for example, again with Asian students, we have 22 out of 765 students with disabilities. They comprise 3% of students with disabilities in the district. Already here we see some kind of difference between the overall composition of Asian students in the district and the percentage that are identified as having a disability. And this same comparison is also done with black students. So here we have 150 black students over 765 total students, and we see that students with disabilities, black students with disabilities, make up 20% of the students with disabilities in the district. Again, we see a disparity here. We see that although black students comprise 14% of the district population, they are classified with 20% of all students with disabilities. So this is one way where we can start to say, okay, something's going on. There's a difference. And this, when talking about students with disabilities and classification, there's multiple factors. Because in some districts, there's a lot of students classified because the resources available to them are really strong and good and help students. And you oftentimes will see racial disparities on that. You will oftentimes in districts like that, when there is a high percentage of, let's say, white students classified, you can see that there might be a lower percentage of black students. That might have something to do with the distribution of resources. So this is one way where we're starting to understand disparities in the district. Now, in terms of discipline, we can do the same thing with, this is a summary slide of the numbers that I just talked about, and it's just showing how there's, what we had just talked about, the disparities between the school population and then a particular outcome. So 14% of the school population is black, but they're 20% of the school district, students classified as disabled. Hispanic and Latino students are 37% of the population, but they're 35% of the students classified as disabled. So you can start to ask questions of like, why might there be more students that are not classified that are Hispanic and Latino? Why would there be more Black students that are classified compared to other groups? And even just looking at these different numbers, knowing your district and knowing your school, you can start to think of some ideas and some reasons as to why there's possibly these disparities or these differences. This is the composition index again, but in terms of disciplinary referrals, because we know that disciplinary referrals often lead to an outcome like a suspension or expulsion, which is what the legislation for disproportionality latches onto and monitors. So in here we kind of see the same numbers occurring. We see these differences between the composition, the number of students across the district, and then the ones receiving the particular outcome. And again, we're seeing that there's a disparity between these two, and we have to ask ourselves as practitioners, why is this occurring, and what does this mean? Why might there be more students of one group being disciplined over another? So now this just gives us a comparison between one group and the differences in compositions. Now we're going to move into the risk index, which gives us more detail about the type of disparity. It's going to tell us what percentage of risk of a particular group, racial and ethnic group, have of being classified, suspended, or referred. And the risk index, like I said earlier, is really a likelihood or a probability of a student in a particular group receiving a particular outcome. And again, this is very wordy, so it's easier to see it within an example. So now, instead of dividing across horizontally, like for example, Asian students is 4 over the total number, we're going to actually divide down. So we know that we have, in this example, we have Black students, there was 259 suspended, and they have 800 total enrollment. So now we're dividing between 259 over 800 to get the percentage of 32.4%. So there's a 32.4% risk of being suspended. And you can see I've also highlighted an arrow on American Indian students. There's a 30%, and it is a small number, and that's why it's a big number, but there's a 30% risk of being suspended in the school district. Now you can take these numbers and compare them to the total district risk, and you can see that there's a lot of disparity there between these numbers. And although this is a fictional district, these numbers represent what I often see in data of districts across the Northeast, of the districts we've worked with, is you'll see that, and this is what the research always points to, is that there is a higher likelihood of Black students and American Indian students being either classified, placed in special education, or suspended. So these numbers are mirroring what the research says. And as you can see here, we have disparities in the risk or probability of being suspended. And we see that Black students have a higher risk over the 14.3%, which is the district risk, and American Indian students. And then you can compare it to the groups that have a lower risk. We see that Hispanic and Latino students have a lower risk than the district. The difference is 12 to 14%. And we also see that with white students. And the literature on Hispanic and Latino students around disproportionality talks a lot about cultural differences and how students are perceived by practitioners, and how, when you have language barriers and different aspects like this, that Latino students are often seen as quieter or in class. And so these numbers again mirror what the research says about disproportionate outcomes. Okay, so this is just a summary slide again of the risk index. So in this fictional district, we have, the district rate of suspension is 14.3%, but we see that Black students are suspended at a rate of 32.4%. American Indian students, again, we talked about, are 30%, and you again compare that to the district rate, which is 14.3%. And you can start to, again, understand the disparity. So now we're not looking at the composition of an outcome, but we're also looking at the risk of an outcome. All right, so I see that there's some questions coming up in the parking lot about the risk index and composition. and how I see that there's a question about how risk is determined. So I'm just going to, before we move on, because the relative risk is related to the risk index, I'm just going to speak one more time about how risk is calculated by looking at this chart. And again, we have the outcome, the particular outcome, which is, it could be a student being classified, it could be a student being suspended, it could be a student being referred, over that total student enrollment. And so we're breaking it down by race because we're talking about disproportionality, and so we're saying how many students of a particular group, in this case I have highlighted black students, have this particular outcome, which is suspension, and what is that rate compared to the overall enrollment of that group. So it's the 259 divided by the 800 that's giving us the risk. And then the composition, if we want to compare what we talked about first, would be 259 over the 860 for black students. So we're looking horizontally for composition. We're saying out of this one group, what is the percentage that this occurs? And then when we're talking about risk, we're saying what's the percentage of this outcome within a particular group, not across all groups, but within a particular group. All right, so now we move on to the relative risk ratio, which is used by most states across the United States to identify disproportionality, and it's also what the push of the recent federal legislation and changes to the legislation to standardize the relative risk to identify disproportionality in districts. And as I mentioned earlier, the relative risk is a comparison of risks of different racial groups within a particular setting, within a particular district. And if you have a risk ratio of 1, it means that the different groups within a district have an equal risk of a particular outcome. So for example, if I were to walk into a school district as a white woman, what's my risk of being a white woman within a school district of being suspended compared to if a black woman or a black man or a Hispanic woman or a Hispanic man walked into a school district, what is their risk of being suspended in this environment? You're comparing all different risks within a context. And so if you have a risk ratio of 1 where each particular group has the same risk ratio, there's equal risk. But we don't see that with disproportionality, and that's why it's embedded in legislation that we have to do something about this. So this is the actual formula. It's an example of how you can calculate the relative risk ratio. But again, it's the notion of taking the risk of something occurring compared to the risk of all other groups. And I know that the PowerPoints will be available so you can look at this formula more clearly. But the main point is that we're comparing risks across groups. And this isn't a sample data for a state that has determined, because as I said earlier, states can pick a different threshold for identifying disproportionality. This is for a state that has determined that you will be cited through IDA legislation if your relative risk ratio is greater than 2.0. So this data is how states might receive information about a citation for disproportionality. And you'll see on the left, we have the race or ethnicity of the students. We'll see the outcome, and with IDA legislation, it's broken up into understanding disparity for in-school suspensions for 10 days or less, in-school suspensions for greater than 10 days, out-of-school suspensions for out-of-school suspensions for 10 days or less, and then out-of-school suspensions for 10 days or more. And I've put in bold where the data shows that there's a citation, because as I talk through the risk ratios and understanding the risk of different groups, this chart lays out how all those different numbers relate to each other in this particular district. So what we have here is we have the number of students that were suspended for out-of-school suspensions. We have 737 of Hispanic and Latino students. We see that there's 4,379 students with disabilities of this race. We have the risk index calculated, which I walked you through. Then we're looking at the number of students with disabilities. We're looking at who else was suspended, who else had this outcome in this district, and we're looking at the risk of these other groups, and then we come up with the relative risk. And I'm not going to walk you through all these calculations because I showed you the basics of that in the other slides, but this is kind of the step-by-step process where we have an outcome, and then we see how this particular racial or ethnic group what fits into this outcome, and then how it compares to all other groups. And in this data, this is again a sample district, but it mirrors exactly, data that I've seen that we work with on a regular basis. We see that for out-of-school suspensions for less than 10 days, that Hispanic and Latino students have a 1.762 risk of being suspended. Now, this district is not cited on that outcome because they haven't passed the threshold. But if you look at the relative risk below it for out-of-school suspensions greater than 10 days, you'll see that it's 2.8919. Here the district will be cited because the relative risk ratio is higher than 2.0. So you will see then that I have in the column yes. So that's how, depending on how your state has set or what the state threshold is for a particular outcome, how IDA legislation has been translated by SEAs and LEAs, that'll give you your threshold, and then you can look at how your relative risk relates to that threshold, and then if you're cited. And now if you're cited through IDA legislation, you're going to be asked to comply with certain aspects of IDA. So you not only have to reduce your relative risk ratio, but you also have to make sure you're in compliance with parts of IDA. And in particular with discipline, it's going to ask you to make sure that your behavioral intervention plans are up to date, your functional behavior assessments are appropriate, there's manifestation determination hearings occurring. So you're going to have these policy and practice changes along with the existence of these high numbers, and you have to figure out, like one of those first slides said, is how am I going to work on changing policies and practices, reduce disproportionality, knowing that who we are as practitioners and our beliefs about students and our beliefs about education and our ability and the opportunity and our capacity to serve all our students all interact. So we're being asked to do a lot when we're cited for disproportionality, and we have to do a lot. So the next slide, again, it's flipping, not sure why. The next slide is just I don't know why it's flipping like that, so I apologize. The next slide is just a visual representation of just showing differences in relative risk. So I had said that we are cited in this district for out-of-school suspensions greater than 10 days, and this is just a visual that if you want to, share something with staff or kind of open a conversation on disproportionality with your colleagues, it's just a way to show that, there's an elevated risk for one group and a lower risk for another group, and then to kind of talk about why is this possible. And without forgetting that there's multiple causes and contributions to disproportionality. And then this is just a summary that's saying what I had said earlier, is that, we've exceeded this threshold, whatever it may be for your state, and that this district is cited, and now you're going to have to do something about it as a district. Now, because disproportionality is so complex, we often see with the districts that we've worked with, we'll see a lot of, we'll kind of see districts we use the language of coming on and off the list. We can see districts be cited 1 year, not be cited for 2 years, and then come back on cited again and be cited then for 3 consecutive years and then off. And so what that gives us a clue at is that, we talked about how disproportionality is so complex. It means that you can't rely on one thing to address the complex issue. And so if we just focus on reducing numbers, and I've been in districts where conversation has been, like let's not refer black students, or let's not classify black students, or let's not refer Hispanic Latino students. When we focus just on the numbers, what we have seen over time is that that is almost, there's a very high likelihood that your citation will come back in some shape or form, because we can't ignore that there's these multiple factors. It might, our discipline policies, or, you know, the instruction and assessment practices that we have going on in the school, along with changing sociodemographics. All these things are coming together. So if we try to find one single solution to address the issue, we're not going to end up having the successes that we need. Because we all know as practitioners that moving numbers is a lot easier than changing practice. So one of the ways that we ask districts to think about their data beyond a citation or beyond the classic ways of defining disproportionality is start to break down their composition and enrollment data. It's time to, like, let's think about what's going on in our district, and let's really think about what our district looks like so we can make sense of what's going on. So there's a couple guiding questions on this slide that try to get at some of the things that I've talked about in terms of the root causes and the complexity of disproportionality. So for example, you could work with staff or colleagues and really try to map out some of the just basic racial and ethnic shifts in your district. So this is an example of a school district over a certain amount of time, and you know, most districts have access to data over time, and you can just plug in the enrollment numbers for you know, different racial and ethnic groups and see what's changed. And this is kind of a typical pattern, and again, it depends where you are regionally, but we are seeing a growth in a lot of districts of Hispanic and Latino students, a slight decline in Black African American students, and white students, depending on the composition of others, seems to be declining in some districts, or it remains steady while other groups are declining. But if we have if we are able to paint a portrait over time of what's happening in our district, we can start to really understand who our students are, and we can start to think about, you know, what's going on. And if we do have this sudden increase of Hispanic or Latino students, do we have the proper services? Do we have translation services? Do we have staff that speaks another language that can talk with families and communities? Because again, remember, family and community ties, lack of or a weak ties is a contributor to disproportionality. And so you can take something like a simple graph like this and speak with your colleagues and try to really think about what's going on in our district and have we responded to these changes. And then, you know, sometimes depending on your preference of visual display, but there's just, you know, you can start to understand that, okay, so we have, this is the same data but just showed in a different way, that we have this growth in Hispanic Latino population. We are having a slight decline in the Black or African American population. Why is that? How are we responding as a school? What's going on in the broader community? Are we relevant? Are we responsive to these changes? And what can we do as a school system? Because the students in our community are the students in our schools, and we need to understand who we're serving and how we're serving them. The other way that you can also think about data in terms of disproportionality is, you know, especially with discipline, when a student is out of school, they're not learning. And we know that for decades we've been able to, you know, document achievement gaps and all these different gaps, gender gaps, you know, all these different gaps that manifest very early on. And so one thing to really consider with disproportionality, especially in discipline, is that when a student's not in school, they're not learning. So if a student's late to class and your school or district's reaction is to suspend them for one day, then they're not only late to class, but they're also missing a day's worth of instruction. And this article, which is provided as a resource with this webinar, kind of thinks about, you know, what's the relationship between the discipline gap and the achievement gap, and, you know, there's consequences of this. And it's important to situate discipline within achievement, because we know that there's achievement gaps, and we know over time they grow. And we also know that based on who's succeeding in the younger grades can often predict who will succeed in the older grades. Research shows it, and these trajectories are sometimes frighteningly predictable. And so it's important to look at who's succeeding in your district. We see in the sample data, and, you know, it's based on different levels of state testing, but you can see that there's higher levels of achievement for white and Asian students. And again, this is data that mirrors a lot of what I see on a regular basis, so I tried to pick something that tells the story that seems very common. And then as you move on to older grades, you start to see, achievement, it starts to go down, but you still have those disparities by race. And so we need to be really aware as practitioners that when we're suspending or disciplining students, that we're also contributing to this gap if we're asking students to leave school or to leave class because they were wearing a hat, or if they were late to class, or whatever the infraction was and the outcome that came from it. We can't forget that achievement and discipline are interrelated and have they both have very strong consequences on student trajectories. Another resource that I provided with this webinar that you can access is a brief that kind of that goes through the different root causes of disproportionality, and it provides some questions like these ones that you see here, these reflection questions, and it allows you to think about trends in your data or trends in your district and think about how your school district is responding or how practitioners are responding, and start to really break down what's going on in your district. So now we're going to move into part 4, which is securing data for analysis. And the only way to really understand what's going on in your district is to get data that is at the student level, which we often have, and within our districts and schools, but to make sure that we're breaking down our data on these different indicators. Because once we understand how students are doing in relation to a particular outcome, then we can start to look at how the breakdown by free and reduced price lunch, gender, race, ethnicity, how those different outcomes matter for different groups. And so when we do data analysis with districts that we're working with, we ask them to provide us not only enrollment data at the student level, but we also ask them to give us special education referral data. If it's in the aggregate, that's okay, but it's always better at the student level because you can manipulate it more and you can try to understand better what's going on with different subgroups. And we also ask, especially with discipline, is to get these different indicators so that we can understand who is being most affected by our disciplinary systems in our schools. And it's really important that not only we look at the district level, because the citation for disproportionality is at the district level. But when you're thinking about that, there could be 8 schools in a district, there could be 20 schools in a district. There could be 2 middle schools that are suspending students at a higher rate than 2 other middle schools, and there could be 3 elementary schools that are supporting students better than 3 that aren't. And then we have 1 high school that's always suspending and 1's not. But all together, all this data at the student level, when we pull it into composition index, risk index, and relative risk, is showing us disproportionality. So we need to understand disproportionality at the district level, but we also need to understand what's going on in each school building in the school or in the district, because then we can really understand where there's hot spots, where we need to focus our attention, where we need to think about providing supports to understand why maybe we might have higher levels of disciplinary referrals and suspensions in one area or one school over another. So we need to make sure, again, to reiterate the importance of it, is we want to have our data people, we want to have data teams looking at disciplinary referrals at the student level, but we need to also compare it. We need our district enrollment and we need our school buildings where these where the referrals are occurring, so that we can have a comprehensive picture of just what's going on in our district. And so once you compile this information, you can start to just pull some information, pull some general trends of what's going on. And it's really important, again, to think about how how these trends are relating at a broader level, which led to the citation, and then how they're relating at the school level. So in this sample data, you just pulling, you can do pivot tables, and at the end of this series and this workshop, there's contact information, but we can provide more resources where we can work with data teams to, just manipulate data in Excel in a kind of simple way to just pull up the information to say, like, okay, what are the top occurring offenses in the school district? Let's try to understand, how many students are actually being suspended? How many students are being referred, and so we can get a sense of, the picture of what's going on and what led us to a citation. And one good way to start is just to kind of break down your data and say, okay, so what are the top offenses across our district? And again, I picked data that really mirrors trends that are across the board, which is that we often see a high number of offenses on subjective disciplinary referrals. We see it on things like insubordination, disrespect, disruptive incidents, and we see this like spike. And the really important thing to think about is that if your numbers are spiking on these kind of interpretive disciplinary terms, that means that there might not be clarity within staff of what that means, or we're having a lot, when we think of the disproportionality of complex slide, there could be teacher misconceptions or practitioner misconceptions that allow one student to be deemed disruptive in one environment, but in another the behavior is okay. But this is a trend that we see across all districts, is that you have these spike on these subjective disciplinary incidents. And then you can also look at your data just saying, like, what's the highest number of consequences? And oftentimes, if you've been cited, you're going to see something come up along where your citation is. So this is just a sample showing, we've got a high number of in-school suspensions and a high number of out-of-school suspensions. It is important when you do pull your data like this to also think about what's not there. So if you have a high number of in and out-of-school suspensions recorded, you could ask questions of, why isn't there more parent contact initiated, or why is that not part of the disciplinary recording process? And you can start to think about, what assumptions are behind, more punitive measures versus ones that are more engaging with family and community. So that's something to think about as you start to paint a picture. And this kind of just really basic descriptive portrait can be done at the district level, and it can be done for each school, because that way you can understand what's happening in the aggregate at the macro 30,000 feet level, and then you can see what's happening within each school building. And again, try to understand what is it that's going on within each building that may be contributing to a high number of suspensions. It's important to note, and I mentioned it, but this is just a sample of an article that supports the claim, is that oftentimes you will have higher number of offenses on subjective outcomes, and it is absolutely, there are racial outcomes on this. So there's a big line of research that states often Black and Latino students are suspended for those subjective categories, while white students are often suspended for much more concrete acts of, school defiance. So Black and Latino students are often suspended for insubordination in comparison to white students that are suspended for smoking or graffiti. That's something you can clearly see, and it parallels the literature that's also on classification and placement. Like, if you can clearly see a disability, or you can clearly see that there has been some kind of school rule broken, those outcomes tend to be along one racial category versus the more subjective, which tend to be along Black and Latino students. So this article is provided as a resource also, but it's just good to be aware when you're breaking down your data and you're thinking about it, what racial groups might be indicated at a higher rate in this disruptive category or other disruptive incidents over other groups. And again, you can get this information by working in Excel if you have your data at the student level, and you can just add a racial category and start to just see the breakdown and have conversations with your staff of, like, what does this mean? Why is this happening? And again, when you manage those conversations, it's really important to think about that disproportionality is complex, because it's not just the student that's acting out. There's multiple factors contributing to that. Research shows us it's not just the student. There's 7, 8, 9 more things that are contributing to why this moment happened within a school that allowed a particular student to be labeled as disruptive, and especially when it becomes a conversation about race and discipline. It's important that we never lose sight of the multiple causes of disproportionality. So the one thing that this is also, these kind of reflection questions are also included in that brief that I mentioned that is a resource. But one thing that we have to be mindful of when we are looking at disciplinary data is that there is a difference between students that often are referred and then that student counted as one. So let me clarify that. I could be constantly referred for disciplinary action 25 times during a school year, but I'm one student. And so when we look at discipline data, we have to make sure that we're looking at this, the total number of referrals that are occurring, and we also need to look at how many students are involved in disciplinary action. And so we need to look at, and I'm interchanging between referrals and outcomes because there's such a strong relationship between the type of disciplinary referral, again, subjective versus concrete, and outcomes. And especially when race is involved, we know that with disproportionality, Black and Latino students are overrepresented in disciplinary outcomes, and it's related to disciplinary referrals that are subjective. So we want to always be looking at referrals and outcomes, incidents and outcomes, so we can understand the relationship between how our school system's reacting to student behavior and what kind of consequences we're putting on that behavior. And so oftentimes when we go into school districts, we'll have these conversations where practitioners are saying, well, this kid X is always in the hall and always suspended, so of course our numbers are really high. And yeah, that's not fair with our, why would that be? But one thing that I've noticed working with this data over and over and over again is that there is rarely a large percentage of difference when you break down the data between students counted once. So I may be referred 25 times, but I'm one student, and versus counted multiple times. There is rarely any difference. I have graphs to show this because it can sometimes be hard to comprehend when you just talk through it. But so this is our sample district. We see that there's about 50% of Black students. There's about 24% of white students. We see with this is composition, what we talked about much earlier in the presentation. We see students with disabilities. We have about 50% of Black students, about 30% of white students. So things seem at parity. There's looks like maybe more white students classified with a disability, but this is our composition. So as we move through the next slides, let's just remember that 50% of the students in this district are Black. So when we break down the data and we're talking about, like how many Black students have been referred for a disciplinary incident, right? So that's the risk index. We're saying here's a particular outcome for a particular group. How do we make sense of these disparities? How do we make sense of it in terms of the composition of the district? And how are we going to look at that? And again, how are we going to look at it when a student's counted once versus when they're counted multiple times in our data? So this is actual district data that I've reduced to counting a student once versus multiple times. So just for numbers' sake, we could say that for the graph on the left where students are counted once, there's 100 students involved in disciplinary incidents in this school, but they make up 1,000 incidents. Right? So we're looking at the same data, but we're thinking about it in different ways. And when I break it down by per student versus multiple times, we see that there's not a lot of disparity between that one student, that student's always getting referred, they're always getting in trouble. Of course, our numbers are high. So when we count them just once and we count them for all those infractions that have occurred in the school, the percentage difference is not that different. We see 64% versus 66%. And this is common in almost all the data that I've worked with school districts, that you will not see a big percentage difference between students counted once and multiple times. Now, we see that that's a high number, the risk index, compared to other groups, and it's important then to think about what does that mean with our composition. We see that Black students are 50% of the school district, but they have a 64 and a 66% risk of being referred. So again, that's food for thought to talk about with your colleagues, to think about, like, why is it that this particular group may have a higher likelihood or probability or risk of a particular outcome of a disciplinary referral compared to all other groups. It's breaking down those layers that are embedded in a relative risk and a citation for disproportionality, and it's giving you insight into saying, okay, like, how are these disparities occurring? And again, you look, this district has 24% white students, but you see in this data, there are only 17% of referrals. Again, why? So we may be cited, we may at the district level have these big issues, and let's say this is one school within there. We need to understand then why. Like, why does this particular school have these disparities occurring? So if we jump back to the beginning of the presentation, we have, remember, those different indices, and there's ways to contextualize them and put them in relationship to each other so we can gain a deeper understanding of what's occurring. So I see that we are coming close to time. I haven't had a lot of time to look at the questions, but I want to just quickly walk through some of the tools that we do use within districts for TAC-D, the Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality. And while those tools are not provided with the webinar, we can, you know, we can field questions and also talk about the sharing of these tools. But basically, there's 4 different things that we have focused on giving districts in order to understand how disparities are manifesting in their district and relating to disproportionality. And the first one, and this is, I know it's a small picture, but basically the district monitoring sheet is going to give us, it's self-calculating. A data person within a district can kind of put it together where you just have different columns add up to each other, but it's just tracking racial group enrollment change over time, which was that graph that I showed that shows one group increasing or one group decreasing. What does that mean for practice? It also allows you to just put into perspective how students' achievement by race, what it looks like, and it's a way of kind of just putting these points of information in one spot to understand some of the complexities of what's going on in your district. The second tool that we give is one that allows us to look at both the district and school level to understand composition indices, risk indices, and relative risk of racial groups for disciplinary referrals. And there's one word of caution with when you do this, because as we all know, a student is not just white. A student is not just black. A student is not just Hispanic. There's multiple identities and intersections of identities that also interact with these outcomes. So while this is a starting point for the conversation, we all know our school districts and our children and our students better than any tool or any broad category. It's important that we allow for depth in the conversations about the students that are receiving a particular outcome, and we allow for that depth to take in consideration of language and ethnicity and gender identity, all these different things that also create groups that are vulnerable in our school systems. So although the legislation is just asking us to look at race, and these are what the tools we have do, is they break down by race at the district and school level, it's important that we don't lose the nuance in that we allow for nuance in our conversations, because as we all know about ourselves, we're made up of a lot of different pieces, and so there might be groups of students in your school or district that are receiving a particular outcome more than others that can coalesce around language and ethnicity also, and so we need to be aware of that conversation. But this tool basically allows for practitioners to type in their enrollment data and type in disciplinary referral data for students counted once and counted twice. And it also looks at by gender, by grade level, by IEP status, and it just lets us know, like, who's being referred more over others, what grades do we see the most issues in, you know, boys versus girls. Most of the data is usually, and the research shows that male students are often the ones referred the most for disciplinary action, and just provides us a picture of what's going on in our school or district. The other tool, I have it called the ABCs, and it's related to the equity calendar. But basically, there's a lot of research that says if you are tracking a student's attendance, behavioral outcomes, and course completion, you can know how far they'll go in school. So earlier we have interventions along the ABCs of attendance, behavior, and course completion, the more likely it is for students to remain in school and graduate. So it's important, again, because of that, the amalgam of issues that contribute to disproportionality, it's important to be monitoring multiple aspects of student success within schools and districts in order to thwart a disproportionate outcome. And so, again, like I said, you can't just manipulate a number and say we won't refer students anymore for special ed, or we won't suspend students anymore, because the issue will pop up again because disproportionality is so complex. So one way that you can also think about monitoring student outcomes and providing interventions at a much faster rate is to think about tracking attendance by racial group, behavior referrals by racial group, course completion, pass, failure by racial group over time, per month, different ways of tracking student success and really targeting your intervention. So we have a Excel sheet that you can kind of type the data in per month on the ABCs, and then it allows us to kind of ask questions of, like who's completing courses, who's dropping out, who's getting referred the most in this month, why is that? And as a data team and as a group, you can then think about how do we intervene here? How do we, how can we be proactive on this outcome? So I know it's a lot of information, and we have time for question and answers, I think about maybe 10, 15 minutes, but thank you, and hopefully we can get to some of the more pressing questions that have been coming up in the parking lot.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for sharing your expertise with us this afternoon, and thank you to all of our participants for your engagement throughout the session. We did notice some of the questions in the parking lot, and so we'd like to take time to have Catherine address some of those questions and allow other participants to pose their questions in the parking lot. I'm going to post this first question from Gavin McGrath from Asbury Park. He's wondering how is disproportionality determined if the population itself is racially homogeneous?
So that is where the relative risk is really important, because this question comes up a lot, and especially with work in New York City, because schools are so segregated within New York City. But oftentimes what we understand as racially homogeneous, when we break down the data, there's differentiation oftentimes between Black and Latino students, and you will see disparities trending towards Black students with discipline. And so if we look at our school data and by race and ethnicity, we can start to see those trends manifesting. And then, as I said earlier, it's important to also think about how ethnicity fits in there, because, Black, white, Hispanic, it's encompassing, it's a large label for many people. And so if your school is, has a lot of Haitian students, Dominican students, Puerto Rican students, there's a lot of students and families within that school that identify along different categories and how those categories are defined in policy. So it's important to, before saying that there are no racial differences within our schools, to just get the data and look deep in it, because what we've noticed with New York City schools in particular is that oftentimes that's where we start, and then when we just start to dig a little bit deeper, disparities are showing up in some shape or form along Black and Latino students. And if we need to dig deeper, we can just add other categories. We can add and differentiate by ethnicity or cultural identification. So I think it's a great question. It's a pressing question, and it's, again, one that is really, really relevant, especially in this this system that we operate in that does have very, very segregated schools within districts and across districts.
Okay. I'm posting the next one for you, Catherine. Right. It comes from Joe Doyle and Lori Emerson. They had similar questions, so I kind of put them together about how risk ratios compensate for an overall lower number of students. And Lori kind of posted asking about if two students within an ethnic group make up a large number of referrals, should we consider that an outlier or represent the overall ethnic group? Those came from slide 39.
Okay, I'm going to go back to slide, let me just go to 39. Actually, before I go there, so that's where this slide becomes really important, because there is often a group of students that comprise the largest amount of referrals, and if you ask anybody in a school building or a district, they can name them by first name and last name. Now, what I was trying to show in this slide here, and I know that there were charts where I was showing risk index. You can do the risk index for students counted multiple times, so that one student has 50 referrals. You can do it for those 50 referrals, or you can count them with the group where they're just counted once. So if we have 10 students involved in disciplinary incidents, but they make up 100 referrals, we can calculate the risk index for both of those when they're counted once and they're counted multiple times. And this slide here that I have up is I've found working with this data is oftentimes, although there is a student, and it may be in a particular racial group, that is the one that is on everybody's radar, that is constantly referred and has disciplinary action, the differences in the risk ratio are often very little between when they're counted once and counted multiple times, the differences in disparities by race. So I would encourage, if there, and we've been in many districts, that if there is a group of students that seems to be taking the most amount of time and energy in terms of disciplinary referrals, that you break down your data by counted multiple times and counted once, and really look at it and see that those disparities are probably walking hand in hand and almost at parity. So while you do need to focus attention on the students that are out in the halls the most, they are reflecting a trend that relates all the way up to your citation when you break down the data in this manner.
I am thinking that takes care of the question that Eric Grubb asked as well. I posted it there. Eric, if you feel like you need additional clarification, definitely post your question again or post another question in the parking lot. And I didn't see any other questions. There was, however, a comment that Christy Howard made. I don't know if you wanted to react to it at all. It's about, she says, it would also be prudent to break down the data per teacher, because one particular teacher could write referrals on students from a particular ethnic background. Did you want to react to that at all?
Definitely. I think that relates to the disproportionality is complex slide, because we do know from data that a lot of referrals come from classrooms, and it's often from certain teachers. But in this conversation, again, it's really important to know that while there are certain teachers that do struggle with classroom management, disproportionality is so prevalent across just multiple contexts that there's something else contributing to that moment. So there are some teachers that just can't manage the classroom, and interventions have to be professional development from there. But then there's also, there's relationship to scheduling. There could be, our students coming back from lunch. There's, what kind of support systems who's in the classroom in terms of the students, what are the reading levels. There's lots of things to think about in that moment. I don't think that we should, because we know that the data says that most disciplinary referrals come from classrooms, but it also makes sense because kids are in class the most during a school day. So I think, to not have the conversation of, again, pinpointing disproportionality on one particular person or aspect or piece of the school system, we have to think about it comprehensively. And one thing that I think will come up in the future webinars is that we often talk about addressing disproportionality as a system, And that relates to a lot of research that's been done on school change. And, you know, a lot of that research came out of Chicago, but it says that there's these different elements to changing student outcomes. And it's, you know, there are family and community ties. You have to have good leadership. You have to have strong curriculum and instruction. You have to have strong professional development, and your student climate has to be positive. I think that's the 5, if I remember correctly. But one of the language that comes out of that is saying that none of those alone will give you a good outcome. It's like baking a cake. You have to have the right recipe in order for student outcomes to increase. So we do know that referrals come from the classroom. We do know that teachers are often the source of referrals, but there's multiple factors that contribute to these outcomes. And so, you know, as we target our work and as we target our interventions and target supporting our students, we have to always think back of, you know, all the different levels of the school system that matter and may be influencing inequitable and racial outcomes in discipline.
Thank you, Catherine. And I just wanted to point out that in the parking lot, Joe did clarify a little bit more what he was hoping you would address. Are you able to see his follow-up question there?
I will scroll down 1 second. Oh.
Right above where I posted Christy's question, he says, my question is, you know, it's really based on how risk can be influenced.
Mm-hmm.
He says 3 out of 10 students have more influence than 3 kids in a group of 100. So he wanted you to address that.
Okay. So I'm going to do my best, I think, to understand. And if I'm not understanding it correctly, just type in to let me know. But if I'm understanding it correctly, this is where relative risk becomes really important too, because we're understanding risk in comparison to all other groups in the district. There are issues when you're calculating relative risk that if the number is small, like if it's less than 10, it can, you know, it's difficult to understand what the data is actually telling you. So there are some like mathematical things to consider with relative risk, but I think that's the best I can answer from that. I might need more clarification on how to take it forward. So, oh, I see he's typing.
And I'm sure if need be, we can probably set up an opportunity for him to pose his question directly for clarification.
Definitely. And I think just to wrap it, like to how I think I'm understanding the question, to wrap it is the reason why that one of the first slides saying that we look at composition index, risk index, and relative risk is because each is imperfect in its own right in identifying disproportionality. But if you can understand them collectively, you can start to see where there's disparities. So if you have a group that only makes up 3% of your student population, but they have a 30% risk of being referred, and the relative risk is high, then you can create a narrative about the group. Okay, it's a small group in the district, but that small group tends to be referred the most, and in comparison to other groups, you know, the risk of them being referred is problematic, and you can start to think through those different numbers and what they mean to try to make sense of why. So I don't know if that also kind of gets at it, but it's good to think comprehensively instead of singularly on the different indicators of disproportionality. But the indicator that the federal legislation really focuses on is more along is like risk indices and relative risk.
He did say thanks, so it sounds like that pretty much clarified what what he was wondering about. And there is a question from Hallie Jones there. She's wondering, are there any techniques or hacks that she should be aware of in which school staff are not even referring certain students based on race for discipline, but these same staff are referring other students?
So, okay, let me, again, if I'm not interpreting the question correctly, please let me know in the comments. But if there's certain students that are being referred and others that are being protected, is that kind of the gist of the question? I think I need a little more clarity.
It sounds like it. Let me see if I can take a look at exactly what she wrote here because she does say a little bit.
I mean, one of the things that, like I said, when we see districts pop up again for a citation, is we will see that kind of manipulation. And that's a lot of critique on the policy also, because when you single out a group and you say this group have poor outcome, practitioners or systems, not even systems, can react by saying, we don't want this outcome anymore, this is bad for us, so I'm not going to refer, I'm not going to do this. But then what we've seen in schools and districts that end up doing that is that student climate really suffers. You're going to see schools where teachers are afraid to refer, or they know they shouldn't, and students aren't feeling safe, and staff is not feeling supported, and leadership is not feeling like their hands are tied in different ways. So I think when you end up seeing certain groups, like if you're reacting to the policy and the group that's being cited, that's also not good, because it has to be a systemic approach. And then I think also a lot of the trainings that we do, if the question's leaning more towards, I see girls being suspended more than boys, or I see black students being suspended more than white students with one particular teacher, that's where the work that I think the webinars coming up, and also some of the more intensive work that the Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality does, is it opens up a space for having conversations about why those disparities occur. And the slide that kind of showed how beliefs, policies, and practices all work together, oftentimes practitioner belief can really drive action. And so if there's a belief that one group is behaving in a way that's acceptable versus one group that's not, then we have conversations about the implications of those beliefs on practice. And so I think there's two different ways we could think about that question.
She did mention disproportionate referrals, so I'm thinking that you are addressing her question. It looks like we have about 3 minutes left, and I know that we have to kind of wrap things up. So any additional questions, maybe folks can follow up when they see some of the contact information for us. So I'm going to turn things back over to Laura Marano to wrap up.
Oh, thank you, Heather. And as I've been listening and actively participating, I can just tell you that I hope you are feeling the very same way that I am. I want more, and more, and I wish this particular webinar did not end at this particular time, and which also tells you a great deal in terms of your need for more training, for more support. And as you can see on this particular slide, there are 3 more sessions that you can certainly take advantage of. And I couldn't help feeling so incredibly engaged, as well as feeling a sense of my interest was even further stimulated by not only the presentation, Catherine, you did an excellent job, but also the questions. Everyone was thinking, everyone is reflecting, everyone is assessing their own situation back at the school level, district level, and what does this mean for kids, which is basically the kind of conversation that we would love to see generated back at the individual school and or district levels as well. The resources, I am positive that you will find to be so extremely helpful. PowerPoint presentations, embedded articles, links to other resources as well. What a wonderful way to conclude today's presentation. And we look forward to certainly seeing you in the near future. But one of the things that I would like to do right now is to certainly clarify a statement that I made earlier regarding the in-person training. The in-person training will be offered to educators out there in New Jersey and New York. I apologize, maybe I wasn't clear earlier. So those who are participating in today's webinar, take advantage, mark your calendar, make necessary plans to get all the approvals at the district level so you can be part of the conversation, continue the conversation with us. I will also say that REL and NYU, as partners with all of us as educators, have done an outstanding job, and we could not be more appreciative. We are so very pleased with the way that today's webinar evolved, particularly when we are dealing with such a very complex concept I was going to begin noting how many times Catherine said complex, complex. It is complex, and we're certainly delighted that you are taking advantage of this amazing opportunity once again. So thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. Heather, I'm going to turn it over back to you.
Okay, great. One other thing I just want to mention is that this is being recorded, so the webinar will be available for you to access later on at your convenience and to share with others who weren't able to participate today. And so, as the slide says, your input is very important to us. We'd be very interested in knowing if today's session met your needs, and we'd like to have any suggestions that you might offer to make the sessions even better. So please provide us with your feedback when you're prompted to do so. So once again, we'd like to thank all of our session participants and thank our presenter, Dr. Catherine Voulgarides. And everyone, just have a great day. It was a great session, and I hope that you'll join us for the rest of our webinar series. Thanks so much, all.
Thank you.